My son said, "Nobody keeps quilts anymore, Mom. It's clutter." So I quietly called the Historical Society, and he found out when the appraiser was already standing in my kitchen with white cotton gloves on her hands, and my whole life spread across the table like evidence. I want you to understand something before I go any further. I did not do what I did out of spite. I did it because I am 81 years old, and there comes a point in a long life where you stop asking permission to matter. The morning it started, I was sitting at my sewing table with a needle between my teeth and the radio playing low. The way I have every morning for longer than my son has been alive. Outside, the maple was dropping its first leaves onto the porch steps, and I remember thinking, the way you think small useless things right before your life turns a corner, that I should sweep them before someone slipped. Then I heard Mark's voice through the screen door. He didn't know I could hear him. He never does. That's the strange thing about children. Even when they're 61 years old themselves with grandchildren of their own, they still think their mother's hearing stopped working sometime around their 10th birthday, the way they think everything else about her did too. She's got boxes of that stuff. He was saying into his phone, pacing on the porch the way he used to pace as a boy when he was working up the nerve to ask for something. I don't know what we're supposed to do with 40 quilts when she's gone. Goodwill won't even take half of them, they're too worn. Too worn. I set my needle down very carefully, the way you set something down when your hands have started to shake and you don't want anyone, including yourself, to notice. I have made 43 quilts in this life. I began at 7 years old when my grandmother put a needle in my hand for the first time and told me a quilt was just a way of keeping people warm after you were already gone. I have made wedding quilts and baby quilts and a quilt for every grandchild the day they were born, their names and birth weights embroidered in the corner in thread I dyed myself from onion skins and walnut hulls, because store-bought thread never held its color the way I wanted it to. And I have made one quilt that I have never let anyone touch without my permission. A quilt stitched entirely from my late husband Ray's flannel shirts, the ones he wore chopping wood for 30 winters on this same piece of land. There is a square in the corner from the shirt he was wearing the day Mark was born, still faintly smelling, even now 40 years later, of wood smoke and ivory soap if you press your face close enough and believe hard enough. Too worn. As if worn wasn't the entire point of a quilt. As if a piece of cloth that has covered 3 generations of fevers and heartbreaks and Christmas mornings, and one particular Tuesday in October when my husband's heart simply stopped beating in his sleep beside me was supposed to look like it had just come off a department store shelf, stiff and empty and new. I sat very still at my sewing table and listened to my son discuss the disposal of my life's work the way you discuss what to do with a broken lawnmower. I mean, some of it's probably worth something to a collector, he went on, and I could hear his wife's voice faintly on the other end, tinny and impatient. But most of it's just, I don't know, Denise, it's just old fabric. We can't exactly sell it. Who buys a used quilt? I think we donate what we can and toss the rest before it turns into a whole thing we have to deal with. Toss the rest. I want to tell you that I felt rage in that moment, something hot and immediate, the kind of anger you could point at and name. But that isn't what happened. What happened was quieter and colder than that. It moved into my chest the way frost moves into a window pane overnight. You don't see it arrive, you only wake up and find the whole world outside has changed shape. I thought about the shirt quilt folded in the cedar chest at the foot of my bed. I thought about Mark at 7 years old, feverish with chickenpox, refusing to sleep under anything else, asking me, the way he asked every single night for 2 weeks, which square had come from which shirt. This one's from when Daddy fixed the tractor. This one's from your birthday, the year he burned the pancakes. This one's from the day you were born, and he wore it for a week straight because he didn't want to wash your smell off it. He used to fall asleep in the middle of the story every time, his small fist curled into the fabric like he was trying to hold on to something he couldn't yet name. I thought about all of that, and then I thought about the word toss, and I understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that something in me had finally, quietly, after 81 years, stopped being willing to wait its turn. I should tell you about the diner years because you won't understand the rest of this without them. I didn't run a diner, that was a different woman in a different story I told once in a different life someone else lived. My life was smaller and slower than that, and maybe that's exactly why the quilts mattered so much. I raised 3 children on a tenant farmer's wages and whatever I could bring in selling eggs and putting up preserves, and every winter for 11 years, from October through March, I quilted by lamplight after the children were in bed because it was the only 2 hours of the day that belonged entirely to me. Ray used to sit across from me some nights mending harness leather or just watching, and he'd say, "You could sell these, you know. Real money, not egg money." And I'd tell him no, not yet, because a quilt sold to a stranger was just fabric, but a quilt given to someone you loved was a piece of your own hours, folded up and handed over still warm. I gave one to each of my children when they married. I gave one to each grandchild the week they were born. I gave the log cabin quilt, the hardest pattern I ever attempted, 312 individual pieces, each one measured twice before I cut it, to my daughter Rosalind when she went through her divorce, because I didn't have words good enough for what she was going through, but I had my hands, and my hands knew how to make something warm. The quilts were never clutter. They were the only inheritance I had to give that wasn't money, because there had never been much money, not really, not the kind you could leave behind in an account. What I had instead was thousands of hours, folded into shapes, waiting in closets, telling the story of every winter I'd survived and every person I'd loved enough to keep my hands moving after dark. I did not expect gratitude for this. I want to be very clear about that, because I think it's easy when you hear a story like mine to assume the wounded party is owed something, is keeping score, is waiting to be thanked. I wasn't. A mother doesn't quilt for thanks any more than a mother nurses a child at 3 in the morning for thanks. You do it because the love has to go somewhere, and your hands are simply the nearest exit. But there is a difference between not expecting gratitude and being told, by your own child standing on your own porch, that the entire accumulated weight of your love is clutter that needs to be tossed. That difference is where this story begins. Mark had been talking about downsizing me for the better part of a year by then, ever since I turned 80 and had a small stumble in the bathroom that landed me in urgent care with nothing worse than a bruised hip and a scraped pride. He started coming by on Sundays with his laptop open before he'd even sat down, pulling up glossy websites for places with names like Willowbrook Senior Living and Serenity Pines, places that looked, in every photograph, like a cruise ship that had somehow run aground in the middle of a golf course. "You don't need all this space, Mom," he'd say, gesturing at my house. 3 bedrooms, 1 story, the same house Ray and I bought in 1974 with a loan we were terrified we'd never pay off. "You don't need 3 closets full of fabric. Think how much simpler things would be." I would nod and pour him more coffee and let him talk. I have learned over 8 decades that arguing with a man in a hurry is like arguing with weather. You do not win. You simply wait and dress warmly and let the season pass. But it wasn't only the quilts. That was only the most recent front in a war I don't think Mark even knew he was fighting. He'd stopped asking about my sewing years ago, stopped asking really about anything that happened inside this house that he couldn't measure or price or fold into a spreadsheet. He worked in finance, something with acronyms I never fully understood, and I think somewhere in the last 20 years he had come to measure the value of everything, including his own mother, in terms of square footage and liquidity and whether a thing could be easily converted into something else. I don't say this bitterly. I say it the way you describe weather patterns. This is simply the climate my son now lives in, and I am a woman standing outside it, in a coat made of a different century, watching the temperature drop. The week before the phone call I overheard, he'd come by while I was hemming a baby quilt for his sister's newest grandchild, my great-grandson, a boy named Theo with Ray's exact chin, though nobody but me seemed to notice. Mark had looked at the fabric spread across my lap, blue gingham with little embroidered rabbits I'd stitched by hand, 1 stitch at a time, over the course of 6 evenings. "You know they sell these pre-made now," he said. Not unkindly. That was the worst part. None of it was said unkindly. It was said the way you'd mention that phone booths don't exist anymore or that nobody writes letters. A simple observation about a world that had moved on without bothering to inform me. Target's got a whole baby section. It'd take you 5 minutes instead of a week. "I imagine it would," I said and kept stitching. He didn't understand, has never understood, that the 5 minutes was never the point. The week was the point. The week was Theo's whole inheritance as far as I was concerned. 7 evenings of an old woman's undivided attention, poured into cloth, so that somewhere down the years long after I was gone, a boy I might only meet a handful of times in this life would have something in his hands that proved indisputably that he had been thought of stitch by stitch, before he ever knew how to think for himself. The morning after I overheard the phone call, I did not confront my son. I want to tell you I considered it, that I lay awake running through the things I might say the way you rehearse an argument in the shower and win every round of it. But by morning, the frost in my chest had settled into something clearer and more useful than anger. It had settled into a decision. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table with the county phone book. Yes, I still keep one, and yes, I know exactly what that says about me. And I found the number for the Historical Society 2 towns over, the one I'd read about in the paper some years back, the one with the young curator who'd restored a set of Civil War-era quilts found in somebody's dead aunt's attic and gotten them written up as far away as Boston. Her name was Priya Anand, and when she answered the phone, her voice had the particular brightness of someone who loves their work more than is strictly reasonable. I have some quilts, I told her. I think you might want to see them. How many? 43. There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause that told me I had, for the first time in longer than I could remember, said something that made another person sit up straight in their chair. I can be there Thursday, she said. Thursday came, and with it came Priya, in a small blue hatchback with a box of white cotton gloves in the back seat and a laptop bag over her shoulder. She was younger than I expected, 35 perhaps, with ink-black hair pulled back in a braid and the calm, careful hands of someone who has learned to touch fragile things without flinching. She stood in my sewing room for a long moment without saying anything at all, just looking, and I understood that particular silence, because I have felt it myself, standing at the edge of a thing so much larger than you expected that your mouth simply refuses to open until your mind has caught up. May I? She asked, holding up the gloves. Please. She began with the wedding quilts. The double wedding ring I'd made for my daughter Rosalind, the flying geese I'd made for Mark and Denise, though I noticed with a small private ache that it had never once in 28 years been on their bed when I visited. She examined the stitches with a magnifying loupe she pulled from her bag, murmuring measurements to herself, occasionally asking me a date, a name, a story. Who made this one with you? She asked, running her gloved finger along a grandmother's fan quilt with corners so precise they looked machine-cut. Though I have never in my life owned a sewing machine that could quilt. My own grandmother taught me the pattern. I made it the winter I was 19, the year before I married. And this? She'd found the shirt quilt, folded at the bottom of the cedar chest, and something in me went very still, watching her gloved hands unfold it, square by square, the way you'd watch a stranger handle a photograph of someone you loved. That's my husband, I said. His shirts. He's been gone 11 years. She looked up at me, and I saw something pass behind her eyes that I recognized. Not pity, which I cannot abide, but understanding, which is a different thing entirely. This is extraordinary work, she said quietly. Do you have any idea how rare hand quilting of this caliber is now? We have maybe 3 people in this whole region who can still do the traditional stitch work you're using here. When they're gone. She stopped herself, glanced at me, seemed to decide I could bear the sentence's ending. When they're gone, nobody's left who remembers how. I told her then what I wanted. That I wanted the entire collection, all 43 quilts, catalogued and preserved by the Historical Society when I passed, each one photographed and documented with its history, the way she'd already begun doing that afternoon. And I told her the one condition that mattered more to me than any museum placard or archival box. I want you to teach a class, I said. Free. Open to anyone who wants to learn the stitches, not just look at them behind glass. If nobody's left who remembers how, then somebody ought to start remembering again. Priya sat back on her heels, the shirt quilt spread across her lap, and looked at me for a long moment. Mrs. Coulson, she said, I would be honored. It was an hour later, while Priya was carefully measuring the shirt quilt for a preservation box, jotting notes on a yellow legal pad, that Mark's car pulled into the driveway. He was early. He is never early. I would learn later that Denise had mentioned in passing, seeing a strange car in my driveway on her way to the pharmacy, and Mark, ever the man who cannot abide a variable he hasn't accounted for, had left work to come see for himself. I heard the screen door bang. I heard his footsteps, quick and heavy, the way they used to sound when he was a boy running in from the yard. Certain something exciting was happening and terrified of missing it. He stopped in the doorway of my sewing room and simply stared. There was Priya, gloved hands smoothing the shirt quilt across the table, tissue paper and acid-free folders stacked beside her, a clipboard covered in careful handwriting. There were 3 other quilts already laid out, photographed, tagged with small paper labels tied on with cotton string. There was his mother, sitting in her usual chair by the window, watching all of it with what I imagine, from the look on his face, must have been an expression he had never once seen on me before. something that was not quite pride and not quite peace, but close cousin to both. "What's going on?" he asked. His voice had the particular flatness of a man trying very hard to sound casual and failing entirely. "This is Priya from the County Historical Society," I said. "We're discussing where the quilts will go." "Go where?" "To them. When I'm gone. The whole collection catalogued properly. And she's going to start a class, teaching the old stitches to anyone who wants to learn." I watched something move across my son's face. A whole weather system passing in the space of about 4 seconds. Confusion first, then something that might have been the beginning of an objection, and then, last and slowest, something I hadn't expected at all: recognition. He looked just for a moment like a man realizing he has been standing on a trapdoor. He didn't say anything. He came and sat down at the kitchen table off to the side, and he watched. For the better part of 2 hours he watched Priya work, watched her ask me questions and write down my answers, watched her handle each quilt with a reverence he had never once shown any of them himself. I noticed him once drift toward the shirt quilt while Priya was in the other room taking a phone call. He stood over it, his hand hovering just above the fabric, not quite touching, the way you'd stand at the edge of a grave and decide whether you had the right to get any closer. I watched him find the square. From the shirt Ray wore the day Mark was born. I'd shown him that square 100 times as a boy, and he had apparently not entirely forgotten, because his hand found it without hesitation, resting there for a long moment before he pulled it back, as though the fabric had grown suddenly warm. He didn't say anything to me about it, not that day. But he didn't leave either, the way I half expected him to, muttering about a meeting he was late for. He stayed until Priya packed up her things and thanked me and promised to be back within the month with the paperwork. After she left, Mark and I sat at the kitchen table in the particular silence that exists only between people who have known each other an entire lifetime and have, for once, run out of the easy things to say. "You could have told me," he said finally. "Told you what?" "That I was giving my quilts to a museum instead of a dumpster." His jaw tightened. "That's not. I didn't say dumpster. You said toss the rest. I heard you, Mark. Out on the porch on the phone with Denise last week." He went very pale, the way people do when they realize a wall they thought was solid has, in fact, been made of paper the entire time, and someone on the other side has been listening through it. "Mom, he stopped. Started again. I didn't mean it the way it sounded. I think you meant exactly what you said. I don't think you meant for me to hear it, which isn't the same thing as not meaning it." He put his head in his hands, elbows on the table, and for a moment he looked less like a 61-year-old man with a corner office and a retirement account and more like the boy who used to fall asleep beneath his father's shirts, asking one more time which square came from which winter. "I don't know how to talk about this stuff," he said, and his voice had gone thin in a way I hadn't heard since he was young. "The quilts, the house, all of it. Every time I try to bring it up, it turns into this whole conversation. About death, about you not being here anymore, and I don't..." He shook his head. "I don't know how to have that conversation, so I just talk about logistics instead. Boxes. Storage. It's easier." I looked at my son, this man who had learned somewhere along the way to speak in spreadsheets because feelings had no line item he trusted himself to fill in correctly, and I felt something in my chest that was not quite forgiveness, not yet, but was at least a doorway leading toward it. "Mark," I said, "I am going to die. Probably not tomorrow, but someday, and probably sooner than either of us would like. That's not a logistics problem. That's just true the way winter is true. You don't have to manage it. You just have to be able to sit with me in it every now and then without reaching for your laptop." He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he reached across the table, the same table where I'd sat that morning listening to him discuss my life's work like inventory, and he put his hand over mine the way he used to when he was small enough to still want that kind of comfort and not yet old enough to be embarrassed by needing it. "Tell me about the shirt quilt," he said. "Tell it the way you used to." So I did. I started with the square from the tractor, and the square from his birthday, the year his father burned the pancakes, and I worked my way, square by square, around the whole story of a marriage and a childhood and 30 winters of wood smoke, and my son sat and listened to every word of it, the way he hadn't in probably 20 years, and somewhere in the middle of it, I saw him wipe his eyes with the back of his hand quickly, the way men of his generation do when they've been taught that tears are a kind of failure instead of a kind of proof. Priya came back 3 weeks later with the paperwork, And this time Mark was there for the whole visit, not perched at the edge of the kitchen but sitting beside me at the sewing table, asking questions of his own. What happens to the collection while it's still, still here? He asked, and I noted, with some private amusement, that even now he couldn't quite bring himself to say the word alive, as though naming the thing might somehow hasten its opposite. It stays with your mother, Priya said. She keeps everything, uses everything until she's ready. We're simply making sure that when the time comes, there's a plan already in place, so nothing gets lost and nothing gets. She hesitated, glancing at me with the smallest apologetic smile, and I finished the sentence for her. Tossed, I said. Mark had the grace to look down at the table. We signed the papers that afternoon, a deed of gift, contingent, taking effect only after my death, with the collection to be housed permanently at the Historical Society, and the first class in traditional quilting techniques scheduled to begin the following spring, funded by a small endowment I set up from what remained of Ray's life insurance, money I had never quite known what to do with until that moment. Before Priya left, she asked the question I had been waiting for, and dreading since the very first day. Is there anything you'd like to keep separate? She asked. Something for the family. Most people, when they do this kind of gift, they hold one piece back. I looked at Mark. He looked at me. And for a long moment the room held its breath. I thought about the shirt quilt, Ray's shirt quilt, the one that had covered a feverish 7-year-old for 2 weeks straight, the one my son's hand had found without hesitation, the one square he still remembered after 35 years. I thought about how easy it would be to say yes, that one, keep that one for Mark, and how, in a way, that was exactly what the old version of me, the version who quilted for thanks she never asked for out loud but had, if I am honest, always hoped for anyway, would have done. But I had learned something in the 3 weeks. Since that phone call on the porch, something about the difference between a gift given to be kept and a gift given to be understood. No, I said finally. Let them all go together. A collection means more whole than it does broken apart, piece by piece, into separate corners of separate houses where nobody remembers the whole story anymore. That's how things get lost. Not all at once. A little at a time, given away out of guilt, until nothing's left but scraps nobody can place. Mark was quiet for a moment. Then he surprised me. She's right, he said to Priya. Keep it whole. I looked at my son and I saw for the first time in longer than I could name, not the man who talked in spreadsheets, not the man who'd stood on my porch discussing dumpsters, but the boy who used to fall asleep with his fist curled into flannel, trying to hold on to something he didn't yet have the words for. The class started that spring as promised, in the community room above the Historical Society, 12 folding chairs and a long table and a box of donated fabric scraps for anyone who couldn't afford their own. 9 people signed up the first session, 3 teenagers who'd found out about it through a school project, a retired mill worker with hands like ham hocks who wanted to make something for his granddaughter, a young mother who'd lost her own grandmother the year before and wanted, in her words, something of hers to hold on to that isn't just a photograph. Priya asked me to come teach the first class myself, and I nearly said no, 81 years old, hip still aching some mornings from that bathroom stumble, more comfortable in my own kitchen than in front of strangers. But then I thought about the words lost art and the words nobody's left who remembers how, and I thought, if not me then who, and if not now then when? So I went. I sat at the head of that long table with my needle and thread and a scrap of blue gingham, and I taught 9 strangers how to hold a needle the way my grandmother taught me 60 years before that. Angle just so, thread doubled and waxed, stitches small and even, and patient, because a quilt rushed is a quilt that comes apart at the first hard wash. Mark came too. I hadn't expected him. Hadn't even told him the date, if I'm honest, some old habit of not wanting to be disappointed keeping my mouth shut about it. But Denise must have mentioned it, or Priya had, because halfway through the first session, the door opened and there he was, standing awkwardly in the doorway in his work clothes, clearly having come straight from the office. Room for one more? He asked. I slid a chair out beside me. He sat down and I handed him a needle, and for the first time in his 61 years, my son learned to quilt. His stitches were terrible that first evening, too large, too loose, the thread knotting itself into small angry tangles he had to pick apart with his fingernails, muttering under his breath the way he used to as a boy learning to tie his shoes. But he kept at it. Week after week, he kept coming back, sitting beside the mill worker and the young mother and the teenagers, his stitches slowly growing smaller and more even, his patience slowly growing longer until by the 6th week, He had finished his first piece, a small square of blue gingham with a crooked, lopsided rabbit stitched in the corner, not nearly as fine as the ones I'd made for Theo's blanket, but entirely unmistakably his own. He gave it to me on a Sunday afternoon, folded into fourths, a little embarrassed, the way you'd offer up something you weren't sure was good enough. "It's not much," he said. "I know it's not. I know I've got a long way to go before it looks like anything you'd make." I unfolded it and looked at the crooked rabbit, at the stitches that wandered slightly off their line and then found their way back, at the small proof, sewn in thread, that a 61-year-old man had sat in a folding chair once a week for 6 weeks and tried, with his own 2 hands, to learn a language his mother had been speaking his entire life without him ever once bothering to listen. "It's exactly enough," I told him. And I meant it more than I have meant almost anything in 81 years. I still have the quilts. All 43 of them, catalogued now, each one photographed and documented with its story, sitting in my cedar chest in my closets exactly where they've always been, waiting for the day, whenever it comes, when they'll travel 2 towns over to live somewhere they'll be looked after properly, understood properly, kept whole. The shirt quilt still smells, if you press your face close enough and believe hard enough, of wood smoke and ivory soap. Mark comes by most Sundays still, but he doesn't bring his laptop anymore, or if he does, it stays in the car. He brings his own needle case now, a cheap plastic one from the craft store, and we sit at my sewing table together working on our separate projects, not saying very much because we don't need to anymore. Some things don't need words. Some things only need hands moving together in the same room, making something that will outlast both of us. Last month Theo turned 3 and Mark asked if he could help me make the boy's first real quilt. Not the baby blanket I'd stitched when he was born, but something bigger, something that would still fit him at 10, at 15, at an age none of us in that room might live to see. We worked on it together for 11 evenings. Mark's stitches have gotten steadier, though they'll never be as fine as mine. Some things I've told him take 60 years to learn properly, and he'll simply have to be patient, the way I was patient, the way his grandmother was patient before me. When we finished, we folded it together, the 2 of us, corner to corner, the way you fold something you intend to hand down rather than throw away. "What do we tell him?" Mark asked. "When he's old enough to ask where it came from?" I thought about that for a long moment, about the shirt quilt and the phone call I wasn't meant to hear, and the folding chair above the historical society where my son learned at 61 years old that some things are not clutter, are never clutter, no matter how worn they get, no matter how the world outside decides to measure their worth. "Tell him it's not just fabric," I said. "Tell him it's every Sunday his grandfather sat with me, learning something he almost let himself forget mattered. Tell him that's the whole point of a quilt, Mark. It's not there to keep you warm after I'm gone. Then what's it there for? It's there to prove, long after both of us are gone, that somebody sat still long enough to love you properly. That's all it's ever been. That's all it ever needs to be." He folded the last corner into place, and for a moment, in the lamplight of my sewing room, with our 2 sets of hands resting on the same piece of cloth, I thought I saw, quite clearly, the boy who used to fall asleep asking which square came from which winter, and the man he had finally, slowly, at long last, become. Outside, the maple was dropping its last leaves onto the porch steps. I did not think this time that I should sweep them before someone slipped. Some things I have learned are allowed to simply lie where they fall and be beautiful there and be enough.